The sun was setting low across the vast desert, pouring a fiery glow over the endless stretch of rugged land. The sky blazed with streaks of red and gold, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath for what was about to unfold. In the distance, the jagged outlines of mountains stood like silent guardians, and the warm wind carried the scent of dust and sage. It was the kind of evening when the old frontier whispered its secrets, where danger and desire could rise in the same breath, and where one decision could change a life forever. The world of the frontier was harsh, filled with trials that tested both body and spirit. Yet within its silence and storms, stories were born that carried the weight of passion, courage, and survival. At the heart of this story stood a warrior, one whose presence commanded both fear and awe. He was an Apache, strong and unbroken, with eyes that had seen the blood of battles and the pain of loss. Every muscle on his frame seemed carved by the land itself, hardened by years of defending his people against enemies and fate. There was something untamed about him, something that could not be held back by walls or rules. He was a man who lived by instinct, and instinct often carried him to places where fire met flesh. And fate played its cruel tricks, yet, across from him, as the day surrendered to twilight, stood a young woman who did not belong to his world. She was a pioneer's daughter, raised on the edge of wilderness where life was little more than sweat and toil. Her hands bore the marks of work, yet her eyes carried the light of innocence, wide and unguarded, filled with questions about a world much larger than the fences her family had built. She had lived her days among dust and prayer, where every sunrise meant survival and every night meant uncertainty. But something within her stirred when she looked at him, this savage figure from the wilds, and she felt a pull she could not explain. The desert wind swirled between them, carrying the heat of the dying day, and it seemed for a moment as if the earth itself hushed to listen. She felt her heart pound like a drum against her chest, each beat echoing in the silence that grew heavy around them. His gaze was fixed on her, sharp and unyielding, as though he could see straight through to the truths she had never spoken. She clasped her hands together not in fear, but in some strange mix of awe and nervousness, as though the very air between them had shifted into something dangerous, yet impossible to resist. This was not the meeting of equals. He was strength, fierce and unbroken, a man whose life had been sharpened by conflict. She was softness, caught between youth and womanhood, untested in the fire of such encounters. And yet something in her spirit did not retreat. Something inside her, quiet and trembling though it was, rose to meet his intensity. She had never known the weight of desire until this moment, never understood how one glance, one silence, could set her whole body alive with restless energy. He moved closer, each step deliberate, his shadow stretching long in the orange light of sunset. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble as if the desert itself bowed to his presence. She inhaled sharply, her breath quickening, and though her lips parted as if to speak, no words found their way out. There was something in the way he looked at her, not just as a stranger, but as though she had been placed before him by destiny. The frontier was full of stories of fearsome warriors, and her family had often spoken in hushed tones of the Apache, calling them wild and untamed, dangerous to settlers who dared to wander too far. Yet standing here, she could not bring herself to believe that this man, with his piercing gaze and carved strength, was nothing more than a savage tale. There was power in him, yes, but also something deeper, something she could not name, yet felt stir within her own chest. The sun dipped lower, and the first stars began to pierce the sky. The silence grew heavier, filled only with the sound of her shallow breathing and the faint rustle of his braids in the breeze. His hand brushed against his chest, tracing the scars that told stories of battles fought and won. Each mark on his skin was a reminder of a life she could never fully understand, and yet she longed to. She longed to know what it meant to live beyond fear, beyond rules, beyond the narrow walls of her upbringing. Her voice trembled when she finally found it, quiet, almost lost in the desert air. She looked into his eyes, those eyes that held both fire and storm, and whispered words she had never thought she would speak aloud. Her confession slipped out between breaths. carrying both fear and longing, as if the truth itself could change everything between them. The moment hung in the air, fragile and powerful, balanced on the edge of what was to come. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the stars above waiting for what would be revealed in the next heartbeat. For though the world around them was vast and endless, it suddenly felt as though everything had narrowed to this one place, this one silence, this one secret she had just given away. What he would do with it, how he would answer, whether he would step forward or turn away, none of it was certain. And that uncertainty was the very fire that made her chest rise and fall with restless anticipation. The night had only just begun, and already it carried the weight of a storm waiting to break. Would he see her as nothing more than a girl too young for the fire she was reaching toward? Or would he hear in her trembling words the call of something stronger, something that could bridge the distance between their worlds? The desert did not give answers. It only gave silence and the beating of two hearts that now knew they could not turn back. And as the darkness deepened, she stood before him, her secret revealed. Her breath caught between fear and hope, waiting for the next moment that would decide whether she was about to step into the fire or be consumed by it. The night grew darker, and the glow of the sunset faded into the kind of silence that pressed against the skin. The young woman stood with her secret laid bare, her heart drumming with both fear and longing, while the Apache warrior's eyes never wavered. His presence felt larger than the land itself, as if the desert had shaped him into something more than human, something untouchable. Yet, in that moment, she wondered if her words had touched him in ways even he did not expect. Her whisper seemed to linger in the air, almost as if the wind carried it back to them again and again. She felt heat rush through her body, but not just from the day's dying sun. It was from the weight of what she had revealed, the step she had taken into a world she did not fully understand. The Apache stood firm, his chest rising with steady breaths, his jaw clenched as though he wrestled with something inside him. She could not read his thoughts, but she sensed they were heavy, shaped by scars of a life she could only imagine. The desert was never kind to those who sought easy answers. Life here was written in sweat and stone, in hunger and endurance. Her family had always told her to keep her distance from warriors like him. To them, the Apache were symbols of danger, men who lived by the law of the wild. But her heart had already betrayed such warnings, drawing her closer to the fire she had been told to fear. The more she looked at him, the more she saw not just a warrior, but a man who carried burdens carved deep into his soul. She thought back to her life before this meeting, to the small wooden cabin her family had built with their own hands, standing fragile against the endless land. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, always stern, always reminding her that survival meant discipline and silence. Her mother's eyes had been softer, though filled with worry each time her daughter wandered too close to the edges of the frontier. They feared what they did not know, and they had shaped her with those fears. Yet now, standing in front of this warrior, she felt as though those fears had been no more than shadows compared to the fire she now faced. The Apache finally moved, slow and deliberate. He tilted his head slightly as though he studied her not just with his eyes but with something deeper. The moonlight revealed the lines on his face, not of age but of battles fought under blazing suns and starlit skies. He was not young in spirit, though his body bore the strength of one who had never bent. Each scar across his chest told a story. Some were thin, fading into his skin like whispers of forgotten days, while others were deep, permanent marks of survival. She wondered what he had endured, what it had taken for him to still stand so tall, unbroken, when so many others had fallen. Her voice trembled again, though she did not repeat her secret. Instead, she tried to fill the silence with words she barely understood herself. She asked him where he came from, what brought him across her path on this night when the stars seemed to burn brighter than ever. But he did not answer. His silence was both unnerving and magnetic, as though words were too fragile to carry the weight of his truth. Instead, he let his gaze rest on her, and in that gaze, she felt as though he spoke volumes without sound. The night was alive with distant calls of coyotes, and the air carried the coolness of desert winds sweeping across the sand. She wrapped her arms around herself, not just for warmth, but for grounding. For though he stood only steps away, she felt as though she stood at the edge of something vast and untamed. It was not just the wilderness of the land she sensed, but the wilderness within him. As she tried to steady her breath, her mind wandered to the stories she had heard. Tales whispered among settlers of warriors who moved like shadows, who struck with fury when their people were threatened. Some claimed the Apache were spirits of the desert, impossible to conquer, forever bound to the land. Others told of their loyalty, of how they carried their traditions with pride, refusing to let the encroaching world strip them of their soul. She looked at him now, and those stories felt real, etched into every line of his body and every flicker in his eyes. But there was something else, too. A mystery that unsettled her more than the fear of his strength. She sensed a conflict inside him, something unspoken that kept his silence heavy. Was it anger at her presence? Or was it something more dangerous? The pull of desire that neither of them dared to name aloud. She could not know, but she felt it every time his gaze lingered, every time the distance between them seemed too fragile to last. The moon climbed higher, and with it came the weight of unspoken truths. She knew she should have turned back by now, returned to the safety of her family's cabin where the glow of a lantern would still be waiting. Yet her feet refused to move. She could not bring herself to walk away, not while the mystery of him hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. She had stepped into something she did not yet understand, and though her mind screamed warnings, her heart silenced them with a steady rhythm of longing. The Apache finally shifted, his voice breaking the silence at last. It was deep and steady, carrying the roughness of a man who did not waste words. He did not ask her why she had spoken her secret. He did not question her innocence or her boldness. Instead, he spoke of the land, of how the desert watched everything but revealed nothing. He told her that every secret whispered beneath its sky would be carried in silence until the day it chose to reveal its truth. His words were simple, yet layered with meaning, and she wondered if he spoke of her secret or of something far greater. Her heart beat faster as she tried to hold on to every word. She felt as though he was giving her a piece of himself, something rare and unguarded, and she clung to it like a treasure. Still, his voice held no promise, no softness, only the weight of truth that she could not yet untangle. The night stretched on, and the tension between them grew sharper. It was not a danger she feared, but a danger she longed to understand. The air seemed charged with something more powerful than either of them could control. She looked at him again, and in his silence, she saw the storm that still brewed inside him. Her secret had changed everything, though she did not yet know how. She only knew that the desert had heard it, and the desert never forgot. The stars above burned brighter, as if they too waited for what would come next. The young woman stood there, her breath shallow, her heart restless, and her spirit caught between fear and desire. The warrior remained unmoved, his gaze steady, his silence filled with 1,000 stories untold. And as the night deepened, the space between them became a battlefield of its own, where neither had spoken the words that could end it, and neither had taken the step that could begin it. The desert held them in its grip, and both knew there was no turning back. Something had been set in motion, and whatever path it led them toward was now beyond their control. The question was not if their worlds would collide, but how, and at what cost. The night pressed heavier as the stars spread wider across the desert sky. The young woman felt her chest tighten with the weight of everything she had already revealed. Her secret hung between them like a fragile thread, something that could either bind them closer or tear them apart. The Apache warrior stood tall, his eyes never leaving hers, but his silence still carried more than any words could. It was not the silence of indifference, but of decision, the kind of stillness that came before storms. The conflict was not just in the space between them, but in everything surrounding their worlds. She had been raised in the safety of fences and warnings, where fear of the Apache was taught before understanding. To her family, the warriors' people were dangerous shadows of the frontier, men who lived with wildness in their hearts and war in their hands. Yet here she was, standing before one of them, unable to run, unable to look away. She wanted to see beyond the warnings, to understand what kind of life had carved such strength and silence into him. The warrior, too, carried his own conflict. His people had lived for generations on this land, long before cabins and fences appeared. The settlers came with axes and plows, pushing the boundaries of his people's home further and further back. Every scar on his body was not just from battle, but from survival, from defending what little could not be taken. To him, the young woman represented that encroaching world, soft and uncertain, yet carrying with her the weight of all the change that threatened his way of life. And still he felt the pull in her voice, the trembling truth she had confessed under the desert stars. The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a coyote echoed sharp and lonely. She hugged her arms tighter around herself, but not from the cold. The real chill came from wondering what would happen when dawn broke. If her family knew she had been here, speaking with a man they feared, they would lock her away in their worry and distrust. If his people knew he lingered with her, they might see it as weakness, or worse, betrayal. The world had no place for what was happening in this silence. Yet neither of them moved to end it. Her mind wandered to her brother, the one who often spoke the loudest about the dangers of the Apache. He would sit at the table in the dim glow of lamplight, his voice sharp, saying the land belonged to those who worked it, that warriors like the one standing before her were nothing but obstacles to progress. She remembered how her father would nod in quiet agreement, his hand resting on the worn Bible that guided his decisions. And she remembered her mother's silence, her eyes shifting away as though she carried her own doubts about the lines her family drew. If they knew where she was now, if they saw her standing before this man, with her secret already spoken, their anger would burn hotter than the desert sun. The warrior's own past was not far from him. He could almost hear the voices of his people carried on the wind, reminding him of his duty. He thought of the raids that had left blood on the ground, of the nights spent hiding from soldiers who marched across the land, declaring it theirs by law but not by right. He remembered the cries of his people when rivers ran dry and hunting grounds grew scarce, and he felt the weight of being one of the few left strong enough to fight. He had sworn to protect them, to never bend, yet here was this woman, pulling him into a conflict that was not fought with weapons, but with something far more dangerous, the human heart. As the silence stretched, the young woman shifted her gaze toward the horizon where the moonlight outlined the jagged teeth of the mountains. She wondered what lay beyond them, what kind of life the Apache lived in the camps hidden away from her world. She imagined fires burning low, stories told in voices hardened by survival. She wondered if he had family waiting for him there, people who depended on his strength. If he did, what would they think of her? Would they see her as a thief, trying to steal something sacred from him, or as a weakness that would cost him more than he could bear? The conflict grew sharper inside her the more she thought. Every part of her had been raised to believe she should turn back, but her body betrayed her, refusing to move. The look in his eyes kept her rooted. It was not softness she saw there, but something unspoken that held her steady. She wanted to understand it, even if it meant stepping further into danger. The warrior finally spoke again, his words low, his voice like stone against the quiet night. He told her of the land, how every canyon and river carried stories older than her family's fences. He spoke of how his people listened to the earth, how they read the signs of the wind and sky. His words were not gentle, but they held truth, and she felt her heart tighten with each one. She realized then that his silence had not been emptiness. It had been thought, weighing whether to let her into a world she could never fully belong to. Still, he did not ask her to leave, and that in itself was enough to keep the tension alive. In her mind, she could already hear her brother's voice rising with anger if he ever knew of this meeting. She imagined soldiers riding across the desert, guns in hand, ready to hunt down the man who now stood only a few feet from her. She thought of her father's prayers, asking for safety while unknowingly building walls of fear. And she thought of her mother, who might understand but would never dare to say so aloud. Each thought pressed against her heart, but none of them were enough to pull her away. The warrior, too, wrestled with his silence. His people needed him strong, unshaken. Yet here was this girl with eyes too soft for war and a voice that had whispered truths she had no reason to share. He wondered if fate had brought her here, if the desert had chosen this moment for reasons he could not yet see. He wondered if she was meant to be a bridge between worlds or the spark that would burn them both. The night deepened, and the fire between them remained unspoken but alive. The desert, wide and endless, seemed smaller now, as though it had narrowed into the space where they stood. Every sound, every shift in the air, carried the weight of what might happen next. Neither spoke of tomorrow, for tomorrow felt too uncertain, too fragile to promise. The main conflict was no longer about land or survival alone. It was about two people caught between the worlds that shaped them, torn by the pull of loyalty and the pull of something neither dared to name. Around them, the desert held its silence, waiting, as if it too wanted to see which would give in first. The young woman felt her throat tighten as she tried to steady her breathing. She knew she had placed herself in the middle of something larger than her own secret. The warrior's silence told her he felt it too. And though neither reached forward nor stepped back, both knew that the moment could not remain balanced forever. The desert did not offer comfort. It only gave its silence and the promise that every choice carried weight. The question of what they would choose, of how far they would go before dawn, remained unanswered. But the tension grew sharper with each passing heartbeat, and neither could look away. The desert stretched in silence. But within that silence, the storm of their unspoken conflict grew stronger with every passing hour. The stars above seemed endless, yet all the young woman could feel was how close the Apache warrior stood, how heavy his presence was, how sharp the line had become between the life she had always known and the one she was about to step into. She felt the pull of him like the pull of the moon on the tide, relentless and impossible to resist, even as fear clawed at her heart. She had given away her secret, and though he had not moved closer, he had not stepped away either. That choice alone carried more weight than anything her family's warnings could ever match. Every sound of the night seemed louder, the rustle of dry brush, the cry of some distant bird, the whisper of the wind moving across the sand. She felt as though the land itself knew what was happening, holding its breath, waiting. Yet the silence between them pressed harder, charged with questions that neither of them dared to answer. The warrior's gaze was unbroken, his eyes dark and unreadable, but she could feel the fire inside him. It was there in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his hands curled at his sides, in the way his chest rose with each slow breath as though he was keeping something at bay. She thought of her family, of the small cabin that stood fragile against the wilderness. She imagined the lantern still burning inside, her father pacing with his worn Bible in his hand, her brother sharpening a blade against stone, her mother sitting quiet but restless. They would not know where she was, but they would feel her absence. They always did. If they found her now, standing so close to a man they feared, the conflict would erupt like fire on dry grass. She knew this, and yet her feet stayed rooted in place. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. The warrior, too, was caught in the pull of two worlds. His people had always trusted him to stand strong, to fight without hesitation, to carry the traditions of their ancestors. But here, before this girl whose voice had trembled with truth, he felt the stir of something that defied the weight of duty. He thought of his people waiting in hidden camps, of elders who had spoken of loyalty, of warriors who had already given their lives to hold the land they cherished. He thought of how easily they could lose everything if he faltered. Yet he remained, unable to turn away, as if fate itself had brought him here. The night deepened, and shadows grew longer. The young woman felt a shiver crawl across her skin, but it was not from the cold. It was from the tension that coiled tighter with every breath. She longed to ask him what he was thinking, to beg him to speak words that could ease her racing heart. But something inside her told her the silence was part of the answer, that whatever he felt was too dangerous to put into words. Still, she could not bear the weight of it much longer. She stepped closer, her movements small but sure. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the enormity of what she was doing. His eyes followed her, sharp and intense, and she felt her breath falter. The air between them grew heavy, as though the desert itself was pushing them together, testing how far they could go before the storm broke. She wanted to touch him, to see if the strength she saw was as real as the fire she felt inside. But her hand stopped short, frozen by the conflict that still burned around them. In the distance, faint lights flickered. She turned her head and saw them, far but moving slowly across the land. Her breath caught. Riders, lanterns swayed in the night, carried by men who did not belong to this silence. She knew at once who it was, settlers. Perhaps even her brother among them, out searching, convinced the Apache were near. Fear struck her heart, sharp and sudden. If they found her here, if they saw her standing with this warrior, there would be no stopping the violence that would follow. The Apache warrior saw the lights too. His body tensed, every muscle alive with readiness. He had lived his life prepared for moments like this, when the clash between his people and theirs could ignite without warning. But this time, it was not only about survival. This time, the girl standing beside him was caught in the middle, and the thought of her being struck down in the conflict made his chest burn with an unfamiliar fury. The young woman's hands tightened together, her nails digging into her palms. She could already hear the distant sounds of hooves against the earth, the faint shouts carried on the wind. Her family's voices echoed in her mind, their warnings, their fears, their anger. But stronger still was the sound of her own heartbeat, calling her to stay, to face what was coming instead of running away. The warrior turned his eyes back to her, and for the first time she saw something shift in his gaze. It was no longer only guarded silence. It was decision, the kind that carried both danger and protection. He stepped closer, closing the distance she had been too afraid to cross. His shadow fell over her, his presence shielding her from the night even as the lights drew nearer. The air grew hotter with tension. She could not breathe without feeling as though the world itself was pressing against her chest. The conflict she had tried to ignore was now unavoidable. She belonged to one side, he belonged to the other, and yet here they stood, bound by something neither of them had chosen, but neither could deny. The clash was coming, she could feel it in her bones, and it would not wait much longer. The riders drew closer, their shouts clearer now, their lanterns brighter against the dark. She recognized one of the voices, sharp and angry, and her heart twisted. Her brother. He was calling out, his tone filled with suspicion and fury. She knew he would not rest until he found what he was looking for. And if he found her here with the Apache warrior, the fire that had been smoldering between their worlds would explode. The warrior reached for the knife at his side, not raising it yet but holding it ready. His movements were calm, but she could see the storm in his eyes. He would fight if he had to. He would shed blood to protect his people, and now perhaps to protect her. She swallowed hard, torn between fear of what was about to happen and the pull to remain by his side no matter the cost. The sound of hooves grew louder, pounding like thunder against the earth. The desert no longer felt silent. It was alive with the approach of conflict, with the weight of choices that could not be undone. She felt the ground shake beneath her feet, and her hands trembled as she lifted her gaze back to the warrior. His face was set, unyielding, but his eyes betrayed the same fire that now burned in her chest. Everything they had left unsaid, every silence that had bound them, now pressed against the moment that was coming. The night was no longer theirs alone. Soon the world would see, and the consequences would be beyond their control. She drew in a shaky breath, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say that would stop what was already set in motion? What could she give him that would be enough to carry them through what was about to break? The lanterns came closer still, their glow spilling across the desert floor, casting long shadows. The riders' voices rose, calling out with suspicion and anger, demanding answers. Her heart raced so hard she thought it might tear from her chest. She looked once more at the warrior, standing ready, and knew the climax of everything they had feared, everything they had desired, was about to begin. The desert night had become alive with noise and light. The riders came fast, their lanterns swinging wildly as their voices carried sharp and angry across the open land. Dust rose beneath the hooves of their horses, mixing with the glow of the moon and creating an almost otherworldly haze. The young woman's heart raced as she stood frozen, the Apache warrior beside her tense and ready. Every part of her knew the moment she had dreaded was finally here. The world she had always known was about to crash into the world she had only just begun to glimpse, and the collision would leave nothing untouched. Her brother's voice cut through the night first. It was filled with suspicion, with the kind of anger that came not just from fear, but from pride. He called her name again and again, demanding an answer. She could feel his fury even without seeing his face, and it twisted her chest in knots. Her father's deeper voice followed, stern and commanding, the voice of a man who believed in rules, carved from the Bible and the plow. He, too, was searching, and she knew what they expected to find. A frightened girl in need of saving from a man they saw as nothing but savage. But that was not the truth of what had happened, and she knew no words could make them believe it. The warrior did not move, his body still as stone but his knife glinting faintly in the starlight. He was ready to fight if he must, but she could see the battle raging inside him. He did not want to harm those who were her blood, yet he would not allow himself to fall before their judgment. He had fought too long, endured too much to give his life away without reason. She turned her eyes toward him, silently begging for him to wait, for him to trust that she could somehow prevent the storm from spilling blood. The riders drew closer, and now their faces were visible in the lantern light. Her brother was in the lead, his jaw tight, his eyes wide with fury. Behind him rode her father, his expression grave, and several neighbors followed, men who carried rifles across their saddles and suspicion in their hearts. When they spotted her standing in the open, their shouts grew louder, demanding she step away from the warrior. Their voices rose like thunder, and the desert seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their anger. She wanted to speak, to tell them she was not in danger, that the man beside her had not harmed her, but her words caught in her throat. Fear silenced her, not fear of the warrior, but fear of what her own family might do if she spoke the truth. They would not believe her innocence. They would not understand what had passed between them. To them, the mere sight of her with him was already enough to condemn. The Apache warrior remained silent, his eyes sharp, his breathing steady. His hand gripped his knife, but his body did not move forward. Instead, he waited. He was giving her the choice. For the first time since this night began, she realized the decision was hers to make. She could either step back toward her family and let the fire burn as they expected, or she could stand firm and face the storm with him. Her brother shouted her name again, his voice breaking with anger. He raised his rifle, not yet firing, but making his threat clear. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. Her father tried to steady him, his hand reaching out, but the tension in the air was too heavy to contain. One wrong step, one wrong breath, and the desert would be filled with violence. She stepped forward, raising her voice at last. It shook, but it carried across the night. She told them she was safe. She told them the warrior had not hurt her, that he had done nothing to deserve their guns or their hatred. Her words tumbled out fast, desperate, her voice breaking with both fear and defiance. She begged them to lower their weapons, to listen, to see what she saw. For a moment, silence followed, broken only by the restless snorting of the horses. Her brother's eyes narrowed. He did not believe her. He accused her of being blinded, of not understanding the danger she was in. He raised his voice louder, demanding she return to their side at once. Her father's face twisted with conflict, caught between anger and sorrow. He wanted to believe her. She could see it in his eyes, but the weight of years of fear and warnings clouded his judgment. The neighbors muttered among themselves, rifles still ready, their distrust heavy in the night air. The warrior remained still, but she felt the strength of his presence beside her. He was unshaken, and that steadiness gave her courage. She told them again she would not move, that the man they feared was not their enemy tonight. She spoke of the desert, of how it had brought them together, of how fear had blinded both sides for too long. Her words were raw, spilling from her heart, but still they carried no weight with those whose eyes saw only division. The tension stretched to breaking. Her brother's finger hovered near the trigger, his face twisted in rage. She knew if he fired, everything would be lost. Her breath came fast, her body trembling, but still she stood her ground. Then, at last, her father lowered his hand onto her brother's arm. forcing the rifle down. His voice cut through the fury, low but firm, telling him enough. It was not agreement, not acceptance, but it was restraint. For now it was enough to keep the night from erupting into blood. The riders slowly pulled back, their mutters fading into the desert air. Her brother still glared at her, his fury unbroken, but he followed when their father ordered them to return. Lanterns bobbed into the distance again, the sound of hooves fading until the night was silent once more. She stood frozen, her chest heaving, her heart pounding in her ears. The desert was quiet again, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavy around them. She turned to the warrior, her eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. He had not moved, but his knife was now back at his side. His gaze was steady, but there was something softer in it now, something that told her he had seen her courage, that he understood the choice she had made. She had stood with him, and he would not forget it. The night carried on, and though the danger had passed for now, she knew it was not the end. Her family would never forgive easily. They would question her, watch her, keep her closer than before. And his people, too, would not welcome the bond that had begun to grow between them. Both sides lived in worlds that feared the other, and neither would surrender those fears overnight. Yet, as the stars shone brighter overhead, she felt a strange peace settle in her chest. She had faced the fire and had not turned away. She had spoken her truth, even when it fell on ears unwilling to listen. The warrior had remained by her side, and together they had weathered the storm. In the days that followed, their paths would not cross so easily. She returned to her family's cabin, to questions and suspicion, to the heavy silence of her father and the bitter anger of her brother. But within her heart, she carried the memory of the desert night, of the silence and the storm, of the way the warrior's eyes had held both fire and restraint, and he returned to his people, carrying the weight of what had almost happened, knowing the settlers would not stop their advance, knowing his people's survival still demanded his strength. Yet within him, too, he carried the memory of the girl who had stood her ground, who had spoken her truth even when the world was against her. The conflict between their worlds remained unresolved, but something had changed. In the midst of fear and hatred, a fragile thread of understanding had been woven. It was not enough to end the battles, but it was enough to remind them that even in the harshest desert, hope could still grow. The story of that night became more than just a memory. It became a lesson whispered in silence by the land itself, a reminder that the frontier was not only a place of division and survival, but also a place where the human spirit could rise above fear, even for just a moment, and though they walked separate paths, the memory of that night would never fade. It lived in the desert winds, in the cry of coyotes, in the stars that watched in silence. It lived in the hearts of a warrior and a young woman who had faced the fire and chosen, if only for one night, to stand together. Top of form,